Thank you, Vince. You brought that psalm alive beautifully. I have a Buddhist friend who's a Jewish woman, a Buddhist Jewish friend who's a Zen abbot who rediscovered his something of his own Jewish ancestry when he was on an interfaith retreat and heard at a monastery and heard the monks singing the psalms. And he'd never realized that the psalms were part of Christian worship as well. And it made him go back to the psalms with the little Hebrew that he remembered. And as a poet, he began to translate them. But as a Buddhist, he had a bit of a problem with saying God. And instead of God, he translated it as you. The you that we find in ourselves. And it was the psalm, his version of the Psalms also bringing it alive very beautifully, Norman Fisher. And as I listened to Vince's rendition just now, I thought, what difference does it make to believe in God? And that expression, believing in God, is very problematical, makes me feel a bit uneasy. It reminds me of my adolescent years when I would argue with my school fellows and John Main, who was in the school where we were, about God at lunchtime. We were sitting at lunch, and it was fashionable, of course, to question the existence of God. And it was the big 19th, 20th century question, which puts atheists against believers. But it's a false dichotomy and a foolish polarization. And we see examples of this false polarization everywhere in our world today, not only on the question of God, but what kind of God, or whose God, or whose politics, or whose democracy. We have so many opportunities for unity, for communication, for being able to have a ecumenical and gathering like this, and a international gathering of friends and meditators. And yet, somehow the world still reverts to tribalism and violence to solve our disputes. I was in touch with some friends in Myanmar this week, and it's difficult to communicate with them now because the military regime has shut down internet and Facebook. And I can only feel the anxiety and fear that they must be experiencing as their freedom has been so obscenely and cruelly destroyed or curtailed. And one can only feel, and I hope we all feel today, as we gather for this Mass, a deep sense of unity and compassion for what is happening in Myanmar, and pray for unity and peace. So what difference does God make then? Not as a kind of God who intervenes on the side of the military or on the side of the of democracy, or on the side of the Republicans or the Democrats. Not that kind of tribal God, because we know God is kind to the good and the wicked, and he causes his blessings, his sunlight, to fall on good and bad alike. Jesus heals the sick in today's gospel. He doesn't ask the sick if they are good people or bad people. He just heals whoever comes and whoever he can heal. So it depends on what kind of God we say or think we believe in. And in a way, when we meditate, we come closer to the atheists who say they don't believe, but can experience God in love, in beauty, in truth, in goodness. In meditation, we stop thinking about God because we believe in God. Precisely because we believe, we know that we can never know God with our thoughts, but only by love. So we let go of a God who we think we know, or a God whom we know only by thinking, for a God that we know we can know best by unknowing, by letting go of anything we think we know about him, and to be open to the direct presence, the real presence, which is what we celebrate in this Eucharist, a direct and real presence. If you waited before entering into the Eucharist or celebrating the Eucharist, if you waited until you understood what the Eucharist was about, you'd never get to the Eucharist. You have to enter into it in order to understand it. So what we celebrate today is not merely a religious God, a God of rules and regulations or a God of tribes, but a mystical God, a God who is in us and among us and not just up there. In Christian understanding, we can see God with a pure heart. Jesus said we can see the Father. That's his word for God. We can see the Father in the Father's mystery and infinite distance if we can see Jesus. To see me is to see the Father. If we can see Jesus, who he is, revealed by the Spirit, then we are seeing with a pure heart. If we move from a God with a small g to a little God that we make and we put up on our mantelpiece or build temples to, if we move from a God to the one God, then we understand the faith of the Bible, the faith of Jesus, the faith of all the great mystical traditions. There is one God, as Islam tells us, and the Sufi mantra is God is one. And if that does make a difference, believing in, being open to that God who is more than anything we can believe in, that does make a difference, because then we cannot see each other as enemies or do harm to each other or try to solve our problems by violence or polarization or condemnation. Because we see clear as the day, as clear as the morning that Vince was singing about, we can see that we are then harming ourselves, ripping ourselves apart inside, and we are harming God in some mysterious way, as Gandhi once said. So God does make a difference to our lives, to our politics, to our families, to all the human ways of interaction as a family, as children of God. So let's take a moment to open our hearts and our minds to that mystery beyond thought that we will celebrate in these words of the Mass and in the sacred scriptures we'll listen to and reflect on, and perhaps most deeply and intimately in the sacrament that we share. If you have, perhaps some of you have a little bit of bread and wine there in front of you, and in the silence of our meditation after communion. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
Reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, O Lord.
On leaving the synagogue, Jesus went with James and John straight to the house of Simon and Andrew. Now Simon's mother-in-law had gone to bed with fever, and they told him about her straight away. He went to her, took her by the hand, and helped her up. And the fever left her, and she began to wait on them. That evening, after sunset, they brought to him all who were sick and those who were possessed by devils. The whole town came crowding round the door, and he cured many who were suffering from diseases of all kinds. He also cast out many devils, but he would not allow them to speak, because they knew who he was. In the morning, long before dawn, he got up and left the house and went off to a lonely place and prayed there. Simon and his companions set out in search of him, and when they found him, they said, "Everybody is looking for you." He answered, "Let us go elsewhere, to the neighboring country towns, so that I can preach there also, because that is why I came." And he went all through Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out devils. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
To see Jesus is to see the Father. That is the heart of the Christian experience and all. But any life is a bit of a helter-skelter, up and down, our moods, good news and bad news. The first reading from Job was the bad news of how we can lose what is most precious to us, be deeply disappointed in life, and feel alone and hopeless. And the good news is what we heard in the second reading from St. Paul and in the Gospel. Thank you to Hirt and Giovanni for opening those two first readings for us. And of course, good news and bad news is what we turn on the radio or open the newspaper or watch the news on television for. And the people who make the news or present the news to us give us a balance that they choose. The bad news that somehow we kind of prefer or we get a bit addicted to, like toothache. And then some good news, some human interest stories to make us feel a little bit better. But how can we bring the good news and the bad news together into the experience of life? Life in all its fullness. So that we're not bumped around, as St. James says in the beginning of his letter, like a boat on a rough sea, going from optimism to pessimism. How can we learn to go deeper into the calm and the peace of God at the center of things? Well, the Gospel actually, I think today, puts it very beautifully and simply. We see Jesus at work. It's all in a day's work. At the age of 30 or so, he had found his work. And he became his work. He gave himself wholeheartedly to it. And it was the work of the Father. He attributed everything he did and said to his own source, not to himself. And after he had begun this work, he never dropped it. He never walked away from it. He never resigned. He never ran away. When he goes into the house of somebody, they tell him somebody is sick, and he goes and he helps them. It's not magic, but it's faith and healing. And we know that he felt power go out of him. So it must have been in some way tiring as well. And then that evening, the same day, the whole town came round. The word had got out, and they brought everybody to him. And he healed every kind of sickness, mental and physical. He was, at that moment, health for them, wholeness for them. And he opened to them the Father's goodness and kindness. Because it isn't enough for us to say God is good. That's a philosophical statement, really. And who wants to believe in a philosophical God? But to say that God is kind, loving kindness flows from God into our lives. That is the good news that sustains us from the helter-skelter. And then he went to sleep. He must have had enough sleep every night. People in those days tended to get enough sleep. They didn't start watching Netflix at 11 o'clock at night. So in the morning then, long before dawn, he got up, as was his custom, left the house alone, went off to a solitary place and prayed. That was his way. That was his life. And then, maybe even before he finished, Simon and his companions came out to look for him. Obviously didn't know exactly where he was, but when they found him, They said, everybody's looking for you. Crowd is there. And what might we say or feel if somebody did that in the middle of our meditation? We say, excuse me, don't you see that I'm meditating? I'll come after the meditation. Or we'd come, but with a certain resentment or grudge or annoyance, maybe, depending on how much good news we'd had that day. But Jesus doesn't respond like that. He says, let us go on to other places, because that is why I came. That is why I'm here. That is his work, what he had to do. That was his focus, his attention, his unwavering attention, his commitment. And whenever we know what we have to do, and we keep the focus and are faithful to the commitment, then we also know what we have to say no to in order to keep that focus. And his focus was what? Healing and telling the good news. Telling the good news that is more than good or bad news. It is reality, the kingdom. And not only does he say it, but he is it, being what he does and what he says. And of course, when we have that level of integrity, we pay a price, because it doesn't really fit in with worldly values to have that level of purity. So, to see Jesus is to see the Father. And in this one day's work of Jesus, we can see the nature of God in the fully harmonized human nature of Jesus. The inspiration for us is not that we put him on a pedestal, but we see him as our teacher from whom we can learn, whom we can learn to become like. It is not enough, as he said, for a disciple to be like his teacher. If we are humble enough to be a disciple. And Jesus, whom they called Master, saw himself as a disciple of the Father and our friend. He accepted his responsibility. That is why I came. We can learn from that by taking responsibility for our own work, whatever that work in our life may be, from day to day or from phase to phase of our life, because it changes. It may be raising a family, learning a profession, doing a mission, believing in your work as meaningful, whatever your work may be. You can make it meaningful because meaning is about connection. If you think your work is humiliating because it's badly paid, or you're not being, treated with respect, nevertheless, it can be meaningful because it is a way of connecting to others. And if you think that your work sets you above others because you're high and mighty, because you're powerful and rich and famous, or you have power over others, then your work is lacking in meaning because you are not connecting. And of course, we have to take responsibility also for ourselves. Perhaps that's the bottom line. If we don't take responsibility for ourselves, looking after ourselves in the right way, having the humility and the discipline to care for ourselves, because we are weak and fragile and up and down, and it will be very difficult to be responsible in whatever work we're doing. And I think in this gospel we can see Jesus going out early in the morning to pray as taking responsibility for himself, looking after himself in the deepest sense. And that is our daily meditation.